That's it. Before she starts, let me clue you kind of what we're doing today. We are dealing with two of the most famous pieces of literature for the last 2,000 years. These Christmas stories, as we call them, in Matthew and Luke. Uh, they are 2,000 years old. They have blessed millions of people, billions of people, probably, for these 2,000 years. They are incredibly rich. They are far more than meets the eye. And so for the last 200 or 300 years, a lot of really good people have worked hard to try to plumb the depths of these two great stories. And so that's what we're trying to do today. Jim, can I help you? You got it? We want to appreciate the stories, but we also would like to try to get inside of the stories to see how rich and important they are. Um, and I'm going to mention a couple of words here, and then we'll deal with them more fully in a minute. Uh, the people through the centuries have regarded these two stories as fact or fable. Take them exactly as they are, angels and wise men and all like that, or fable, sort of like Mother Goose or Hans Christian Andersen or something like that, just a fable. The last many years, a lot of people who I respect greatly have tried to understand the two stories. You ready for this phrase? Parabolic overtures. The overture, an overture that she's going to play for us in a minute from Handel's Messiah. An overture sets the stage for the bigger piece. Handel wrote the Messiah, 1780 or something like that. He wrote the whole thing. He and a friend wrote it to her. He couldn't write the overture until he had written the whole piece, because the overture reflects what's in the piece. And so what we have here in Matthew and Luke are overtures of the ministry of Jesus. Okay. So let's listen to Handel's Messiah's overture here. Okay. Thank you. If we were professors of music, which I'm not, maybe you are, you could hear in that overture the major themes of the great piece of music that Handel wrote, because the overture is designed to capture, to set the flavor, the tone for the bigger piece of music. Okay. How many of you have ever been to a performance of the Messiah? Yeah, a lot of us have, yes. Uh, and it starts always with that overture. And then the first aria is that great line from Isaiah 40, comfort ye, comfort ye, my people. It's a tenor piece, gorgeous. Uh, but that is the overture, okay? So keep in mind now, as we began to look at Matthew and Luke's stories of the birth of Jesus, we are looking at overtures, okay? Uh, we'll talk about that a whole lot more as we get into it, but uh, what Matthew and Luke did on purpose, very skillfully, is they included in that story, in the opening stories, they gave clues to the overall ministry of Jesus. Come in, uh, come right in. Uh, oh, uh, so we will look at that more carefully as we get along into this. But the design of the stories, the two stories, Matthew and Luke, is to be a prelude and overture to the larger ministry of Jesus. Okay. Now, kind of keep that in your head. I'm going to talk about another piece of this also that is very interesting to me. The four gospels, really all that we know about Jesus, the person Jesus, all that we know are the four gospels. And they are sketchy. They were never designed to be biographies. The four gospels are faith statements by four different men, four different authors. The four men who wrote this had their own experience with Jesus, probably pretty far down the line, because these were written later into that first century. So out of their experience with what they were understanding of Jesus in their time and what they were learning about Jesus in his time, they put the gospels together. They wrote the gospel. They're all four different. There's a lot of similarities, but they're all four different also. Uh, so they wrote the gospels. All four of the gospels are written backward. They are written from the standpoint of the crucifixion and Easter. They are written from the standpoint of the cross resurrection event. That's where, when you look at the four gospels, the biggest portion of all four of the gospels deals with the final days of Jesus, the arrest, crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's the major part of these four gospels. So they that's where they started. That was best known where they started. And then as they wrote, they filled in other aspects of the ministry of Jesus that they had come to know and understand. And then Matthew and Luke, for their own reasons, good reasons, decided that they would include a birth story of each for their two gospels. So written first, back, finally the birth story. And that's the way we write about great men. Nobody would give a care to know that a fellow named Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky or Missouri or somewhere. Nobody would care about that at all. Nobody cares where I was born, you know. But because Abraham Lincoln was so important and so essential to the life of the nation, then we want to find all about him. And that's when we go further back, uh, and find out more and more that we can about Abraham Lincoln. So all of these great books are written from the ending back, from what the person did back to their birth. So that's the basic way that the Gospels were written, and these two stories were included. Okay, uh, so Matthew and Luke, of the four Gospels, only Matthew and Luke give any notice at all to the birth and childhood, growing up of Jesus. They have snatches. Mark and they all have a snatch. We get an idea in Mark about his brothers and that Joseph and Mary were in there, but that's really incidental to the story in the four Gospels. Okay, uh, so we don't know much about it, and and Mark and John and Paul tell us nothing at all about the birth and childhood of Jesus. They just do not include that in their writings at all. So that's not there. Uh, Paul writing first, Paul's writings in the 50s Common Era uh, were the first writings to survive and make it into the New Testament. 50 to 55 to 60, Paul wrote, probably was executed in about 65 by Rome, the Emperor Nero or somebody. Uh, and then Mark is the first gospel, emerged in 65, 68, or 70, or somewhere along in there. Mark is the first gospel. Now, the way it shows up in the New Testament, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. But if you did it chronologically, you would have you would have Mark, Matthew, John, and probably Luke, and then Acts, that kind of way. So if you did it chronologically, that's the way that it would appear. And that is prevailing scholarship, that Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels. Mark includes nothing initially about the life of, about the birth of Jesus. But Mark includes nothing about the birth of Jesus. Mark's gospel starts out with John the Baptist, and then it starts out also with Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, and then being baptized and the temptation and all of that. It's the way that Mark does his thing. Uh, John has a different take entirely that's not really germane to what we're doing. Come in, Harold. We're glad to see you, guy. There we go. So we're trying to set it up here, how all of this stuff happened. Here we are in the 21st century, and we could just think it all just happened. That I punched a button on my laptop, and here came the whole thing. Pop, 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 pop out. That's not the way that it happened. It happened over time. It happened historically. It happened in the context of the times in which they lived and wrote. So now we can just float along and we do that. Fine. You just take it. That's a good story. Okay. For my part, for a long, long time, I've wanted more from the Bible. I wanted to know where it came from. A scholar that I respect says of any great document, we need to ask the 5 W's: who, where, when, why, and what. Who, where, when, why, and what. I have an idea that Jim, in doing his accounting work in Decatur for all of those years, wanted to know everything that he could about accounting. And as the accounting world changed and his business changed, he wanted to know more. John is over here was a genius apparently in the carpet business. John's son says that John early developed a system that enabled the carpet companies to know what they were doing. So John is a computer whiz there, and others of you have skills like that also. I've always wanted to know more, so I've poked around, studied, thought. I've said many times that people actually paid me a living to read and study and try to find myself a way around in the Bible. Not just any book. The Bible is the Bible. The Bible is the most important Bible in Western literature. And so the more that we can know about it, the better. So the four Gospels, you can kind of begin to see how they unfolded there. No, far as we know, number one, nobody knows who wrote the Gospels. We have names to them that the church fathers added on in the second and third centuries, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But really, nobody knows who wrote any of those four Gospels. So that's just the way that it is. And the titles are handy. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are handy, but nobody knows who they were. Nobody really knows from where they were written and to whom they were written. That's another interesting little piece of historical trivia there. But the four Gospels, along with the other part of the New Testament, have shaped the Western world for 2,000 years. So we're not dealing here with just an abstract piece of literature. You're dealing here with something of great historic importance. Okay. So the Gospels. Remember sort of that Matthew and John and Paul, or Paul, John, Matthew, do not give us any clue at all about Jesus, the person. Hardly. Well, that's not fair. Paul does not. Uh, John and uh, uh, Mark give us ideas about Jesus, but nothing about how he got started. So just those little pieces there. So, how then do we understand these four stories? Uh, for the first 1800 years or so, 15, 1600 years after Jesus' time, nobody gave a thought about where these stories came from. They were just there. They were acted out in thousands and thousands and thousands of pageants. We probably, when we were children, all were in some kind of Christmas pageant. I was dressed up in my father's bathrobe, walk down the aisle belting out, "We Three Kings of Orient are." We've all done those kinds of pageants. Uh, so we've done it. But what we have also done, just normally, just naturally, we have blended the two stories together. We have made Matthew and Luke as if they were one story. And every Christmas pageant that the kids do will just without any thinking, without any equivocation, blend the stories together. So we've talked about when you see the creche around here in the building, you'll see the stable, the star, the wise men, the animals, the angels, the shepherds, Mary and Joseph in the manger, and the baby in the manger. Uh, you begin to look at the two stories, and you'll see how different they are, how separate they are in the way they present the story of the birth of Jesus. So we've run them together. We're not going to separate them. No matter how much we study and think about the two stories, that's the way it is in our American culture. The two stories are blended together. But you guys and I are budding scholars. So we want to know better what we've got here. Matthew has one entirely different scenario for the birth of Jesus, and Luke has another entirely different scenario for the birth of Jesus. Uh, and what we will begin to do today is to think about some of the differences, and then next week we will deal specifically with the two stories and begin to see how incredibly rich and at one level complicated they are. But today we can sort of begin to think about how they all come together. Okay. Uh, so Mark is the oldest gospel. Mark is the pinnacle up here. It's pretty clear that Mark did his own thing. We don't really know the sources that from which Mark drew to write his gospel. A lot of scholarship where it all came from. It is also quite clear that Matthew and Luke knew about Mark and drew the broad outline of the ministry of Jesus from Mark up here. But there's no reason to believe that Matthew and Luke knew each other. So there was, as far as anybody talks, there was no collaboration between Matthew and Luke. The broad outline of the ministry of Jesus would come from Mark, but the two stories that we have, the birth stories of Matthew and the birth stories of Luke, are very different and came from other sources other than from each other. Been big debates about that, but we won't get into that because I don't I don't know all those debates anyway. But they're very different stories. Okay, very different stories. Uh, and to go back to the idea of the overture, but both Matthew and Luke, in telling their version of the birth of Jesus, both of both of these stories lay out the broad picture of the way Matthew understood the ministry of Jesus and Luke understood the ministry of Jesus. Remembering that Matthew and Luke had seen Mark's gospel, Mark's writing was out there. Uh, Matthew probably 80 or 90, written 80 or 90. Luke maybe as late as 110 or something like that. So in ways that can only be speculated, Mark's gospel was making its way through these developing Jesus groups, small groups all over, I mean, through parts of the Roman Empire, along the coast of the Mediterranean, all around to Rome and Greece, and all like that. Still very small, very spotty, no organization. They were not yet calling themselves Christians. Uh, the word church was not yet in vernacular. They were groups, they were clubs, they were just organizations, and they knew very little about Jesus. Excuse me. Apparently, word was out that this Jesus man from Galilee, number one, was killed by the Romans, which made him an immediate hero among the peasants, all of whom hated Rome and all of whom had suffered under the Roman Empire. So here was a good man, very able man, Jesus of Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth, who had been killed by the Romans. So he was immediately a hero. And the word was out that he was very compassionate, caring. He cared about them, and he could also do some kind of healing stuff. Don't know how all of that happened, but that was out. And so these groups began with what information they had to form themselves around what they knew of Jesus. Okay, that's okay. Y'all with me on that one? Uh, how small it was, how spotty it was, how episodic it was, and yet it was happening. It was happening. Something was of very fundamental importance was taking place in those opening decades of that what we now call the first century. Okay, we don't know what all it was. So uh, Matthew and Luke, uh, they didn't know each other, but out of their own hearts, their own desire to know and to become followers of Jesus that much more, imagined imagined the birth stories. But they did not just imagine them out of nothing. They imagined the birth stories of Jesus out of deep the Hebrew Bible, of Hebrew history plays out in these two important stories. Okay, uh, and when you're on Jeopardy, uh, and they ask you what was Matthew trying to do, what was Matthew's main purpose in the birth narratives, and I think it's pretty clear that Matthew's main purpose was to show that Jesus was superior, was ahead of Moses. Jesus was better. Jesus was more of God. Jesus was a later revelation from God than Moses. So Matthew, Jewish scholar, linguist, very, very able writer, no doubt, deeply immersed into the Hebrew Bible, gave us this rendering of the birth of Jesus through the filter of Hebrew history. And we'll talk about that more later. But that was his filter. That was his purpose, to show uh, that Jesus was superior to Moses, and that the Jews to whom Matthew was writing could trust Jesus to be one of them, not to be displacing Moses, but to be superior and if or ahead of the better revelation of God than even Moses of the past. So we'll get into a lot of that, a lot of the pieces that Matthew includes in there, intends to underscore that. Luke's major purpose, I think, was to show Jesus' superiority over the Roman Empire to show Jesus' superiority over Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus, Octavian, the great nephew of Julius Caesar, um, all that kind of stuff in those early days, was the ruler of the world, undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean world and much of that part of the world. He was called Son of God. He was called uh, Bringer of Peace. All of the kinds of words that those early people gave to Jesus. Augustus already had those tagged to his name. Luke as the Gentile, maybe even a Roman citizen. Luke wanted to show that Jesus was superior to Caesar Augustus. Luke wanted to show that the kingdom of God, his language was the kingdom of God, was superior and would outlive the Roman Empire, the kingdom of Caesar, which happened, it took 500 years, but that's what happened over the long haul. So those two purposes there, Matthew to show that Jesus was ahead of Moses, Luke to show that Jesus was ahead of Caesar Augustus. So that was the major purpose, I think, of Matthew and Luke. I mean, their overriding ethos, their overriding filter there to show what they were writing about. Uh, so that you kind of get the big picture there. Uh, Poetry and imagination, uh, parabolic overture. Uh, but at the same time, both stories are full of history. Uh, Full of history. Uh, Both Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, there was Herod, Archelaus, there was Egypt, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, all of the aspects. Joseph, Mary, the wise men, star, the killing of the babies. I mean, they included these aspects. Matthew did of his story of Jesus. So there's history. Luke has the Roman Empire. He has Caesar Augustus. He has Mary, Joseph, angels, Bethlehem, uh, donkeys, the whole bit. So there's history there. Uh, but the two documents have history, but they are not historical. They have history, but they are not historical. George Washington may have cut down a cherry tree. We don't know that. He may have cut down the cherry tree. Washington had a, a, a an aura of really strength and leadership and uh, ability about him and truthfulness. Uh, so he could have cut down the cherry tree. And when his father said, "Who cut the cherry tree?" Washington could have said, "Daddy, I did it." So there's some history there, but it's not historical, you see. So that's what we've got here in Matthew and Luke. We have history, but it's not historical. Uh, and the charm to me in this idea of the overture, it gives me the framework, gives me something to work with to understand the stories, not as fact. There are facts involved, but for me, I don't believe the shepherds saw angels. We'll get into that. Uh, it could have happened. I just don't think that's the way that it happened. But the story of angels is important. The poetry, the imagination, the idea of angels and speaking and shepherds and all of that is very important. Uh, Same thing with Matthew. Stars in the heavens don't come to rest over a barn. Uh, We know now that stars are millions and millions of light years away. They are huge, humongous balls of fire. Stars don't come. Uh, People have tried to do all kinds of stuff to show how a star might have come over over the barn where Jesus allegedly was born. Uh, that kind of thing doesn't happen, but it's still a great story, even though the star, as we understand a star, did not come and rest over the barn where Jesus was born. Matthew does not even talk about the barn. Luke talks about the no room in the inn, wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. Uh, Matthew does not include that. The star comes in Matthew, and we'll look at this more. The star picture comes in Matthew when the wise men come looking for Jesus. They had seen his star in the east. They went to Jerusalem and asked Herod where King of the Jews is to be born. We have seen his star in the east and have come to. So all of that kind of picture stuff is there. Uh, I think we'll stop here. That's enough of a background. And then next week we will look at the two stories a bit more carefully and see kind of where they came from and the wonderful pieces that are there. So, how does this work with you guys?
Great.
Huh?
Great.
Is that okay? Nothing shakes you too much from that. Uh, so we're not dealing with Santa Claus here. Santa Claus is a fable. We're not dealing with a fable. We're dealing with some facts, but the overall thing that we're dealing with is is a magnificent story of faith and opportunity. I think that's what we've got here. Uh, great pieces, great stories, magnificent. Uh, 2,000 years of particularly Western history is all bound up here. Uh, Thanks to Santa Claus in the 19th century, uh, Christmas has become the the biggest selling time in Western civilization also. So it's a big deal from that standpoint. But it's a gorgeous story. And we can begin to kind of pick at that a little bit and see the various aspects of it. And it kind of goes on and on. A parable, as we're finding out, really has no end to it. Uh, the parables of Jesus in Luke and all the Gospels. Uh, I don't, John, I don't think he has any parables, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. Those stories don't have any end. You can go and go and go. Uh, Jesus gave the parables to be open ended and for you to find yourself in the parable. And that's the same thing we have with these opening two stories here. They are parables, they are clues, they are invitations to explore, to think, to find yourself uh, in all of this. Okay?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
This cover just what you've talked about today, or you
Yeah.
both doing for next week?
What I'm going to do next week is look almost line by line of the two stories. You don't have to keep up with that. I'm not proud of when I look back over those notes, they're too scrappy. Uh, so you can read them if you want to and overlook the typos and the misspellings and all. I mean, okay, but I'm going to improve on that. I think we can do a lot better with that. Uh, but you get the clue. This is my clue now. People everywhere would take serious exception. Some people would say, absolutely, what we have in Matthew and Luke is exactly what happened. Angels come, stars come, all of this kind of stuff. I think it's a, I think it's, I think there's a different story here, and it's what I have ferreted out over the last many decades, and it's comfortable to me. I'm not threatened by this. I'm thoroughly a Jesus person. Whatever these two stories might really bring, or whatever they might imply. But and I think my grandkids, particularly one of them, Peter, would be more interested in this approach that I'm taking to the stories than to try to make them angels and stars and wise men and all of that stuff. Virgin birth, virgin conception, we can deal with all of that. And there are very good reasons, historic, theological reasons why the two stories include these various aspects. They are important, if not factual, if not historical, they are nonetheless important for us to think about. Okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. It's fun to work on it. So we'll do a lot more with it next week. Good.